this episode, we focus on something that sounds simple but determines whether every later risk discussion is useful or useless: establishing risk context. Risk context is the set of boundaries and rules that tell everyone what system you are talking about, what conditions you are assuming, and how decisions will be made when trade-offs appear. Beginners often jump straight into listing threats and vulnerabilities, but without context, those lists become endless and confusing because any system can be threatened in 1,000 ways. Context makes risk analysis practical by narrowing attention to what matters for this system, in this environment, for this mission, with these constraints. When context is missing, teams argue past each other because they are silently using different assumptions about what is in scope, what is acceptable, and what must be protected first. Establishing context is not about making the risk look smaller. It is about making the risk assessment fair, repeatable, and defendable. If you can set scope, state assumptions clearly, and define decision criteria, you create a strong foundation for the rest of the risk management lifecycle. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start with scope, because scope is the answer to the question, what exactly are we assessing? A system might mean a single application, a set of services, a business process that uses multiple technologies, or an entire mission platform. If you do not define the boundary, people will pull the conversation in different directions, and risk findings will be inconsistent. Scope includes what components are included, such as servers, databases, client devices, network segments, identity services, and third-party services. Scope also includes interfaces, meaning how the system connects to other systems and how data moves across boundaries. A beginner should learn to define scope in a way that is neither too tiny nor too huge, because both extremes cause problems. Too tiny, and you miss real attack paths through dependencies and integrations, and too huge, and you drown in complexity that prevents meaningful decisions. A well-defined scope is large enough to capture the system's real operational behavior, but bounded enough that you can analyze it with available time and evidence. When you define scope, you also define what is out of scope, and that is just as important because it prevents hidden assumptions. If a system relies on a shared enterprise identity provider, you may decide that the identity provider is a dependency and not part of the assessed system, but you still need to capture how that dependency affects risk. If a cloud platform provides certain protections, you may treat those as external services, but you must still understand what you rely on them for. Out of scope does not mean irrelevant. It means managed elsewhere, and you must record where and how it is managed. This is crucial for beginners because it teaches you that risk boundaries are not walls that stop risk. They are lines that define responsibility and analysis focus. Clear scope boundaries also help prevent blame shifting, because everyone can see what the assessment covers and who owns what outside that boundary. Now move to assumptions, because every risk assessment depends on conditions that may or may not be true. Assumptions are statements you accept as true for the purpose of analysis, such as the system will run in a specific environment, users will authenticate through a particular identity method, or certain network protections will exist. Some assumptions are technical, like the system is patched regularly, and some are organizational, like there is an incident response team that can respond within a certain time frame. Assumptions can also include data assumptions, like the system will handle only non-sensitive data, which dramatically changes risk. The danger is not having assumptions. The danger is having assumptions that are unstated, because then people treat them as facts until reality contradicts them. When assumptions are explicit, they can be tested, challenged, and updated, which is how risk management stays connected to real system behavior. For beginners, learning to state assumptions clearly is one of the best ways to avoid both false confidence and unnecessary alarm. Assumptions should also be categorized by confidence, because not all assumptions are equally solid. Some are backed by contracts, policies, or verified configurations, while others are based on intention, like we plan to implement monitoring soon. Low-confidence assumptions should be treated as risk factors, because if the assumption fails, the risk picture changes. For example, If you assume logging is complete, but you have not verified log coverage, then undetected incidents become more plausible, and your risk assessment should reflect that uncertainty. A mature context statement includes not only the assumption but what evidence supports it and what would happen if it is false. This does not require deep technical implementation details. It requires disciplined thinking about what you truly know and what you are hoping is true. When you are honest about confidence, leaders can decide whether to invest in confirming assumptions or in building controls that reduce dependency on them. Decision criteria are the third pillar, and they answer the question, how will we decide what to do about the risks we find? Decision criteria include risk appetite, tolerance, and the specific thresholds that trigger action, escalation, or acceptance. For a system, criteria might include unacceptable impacts, such as any risk that could cause a safety issue, expose regulated data, or prevent critical mission operations. Criteria also include constraints, such as limited downtime windows, fixed budgets, or staffing limits, because constraints shape what mitigations are feasible. Decision criteria should define what counts as sufficient evidence for a decision, because people often disagree not about the risk itself, but about what evidence is needed to approve a mitigation. For example, one group may be satisfied with a vendor statement, while another requires independent verification. Clear criteria prevent endless debate by setting expectations up front about what kind of proof supports risk acceptance. For beginners, criteria are what turn risk talk into decision-making rather than an endless list of worries. It helps to understand that decision criteria must balance security ideals with mission reality, because systems exist to deliver value, not to be perfectly secure in isolation. That does not mean you accept unnecessary risk. It means you acknowledge trade-offs openly. For example, a system might accept a slightly higher availability risk during a planned upgrade period because the long-term security benefits are significant, but it would not accept that same risk during a critical mission event. Decision criteria can include time-based conditions like that, defining when certain risks are tolerable and when they are not. Criteria can also define priority ordering, such as prioritizing confidentiality over convenience for sensitive records or prioritizing availability over feature changes for operational systems. When criteria are defined, people can make consistent choices even under pressure. This is what keeps security decisions from becoming reactive and inconsistent across teams. A key part of establishing context is identifying stakeholders and their objectives, because risk decisions affect different groups in different ways. The system owner may care about mission delivery, the privacy office may care about data exposure, operations may care about stability, and finance may care about cost and contracts. If you do not capture stakeholder objectives, you might optimize for one perspective and unintentionally create risk from another perspective. Stakeholders also influence decision criteria because they help define what impact is unacceptable and what trade-offs can be tolerated. For beginners, it is important to see that risk context is not just technical, it is also organizational, because systems exist in human institutions with rules, oversight, and competing goals. Capturing stakeholder context does not require political maneuvering. It requires clear understanding of who is affected and what success means for them. When stakeholder objectives are visible, risk criteria become more realistic and more defensible. Risk context also includes defining the system's operational environment, because environment shapes threat exposure and control feasibility. A system used only on an internal network has different exposure than a system available to the public internet. A system used by a small trained staff has different access control challenges than a system used by thousands of users with varying skill levels. A system that relies on remote work has different identity and device risks than a system used only in a controlled facility. Environment also includes dependencies like cloud services, third-party integrations, and external data sources, because those dependencies expand the attack surface and introduce shared responsibility. If you ignore environment, you may select mitigations that do not work in practice or assume protections that do not exist. Establishing context means painting a realistic picture of where the system lives and how it is used, so risk analysis is grounded in real conditions rather than abstract models. A common misunderstanding is that scope, assumptions, and decision criteria are paperwork, but they are actually tools for reasoning and communication. They allow different teams to collaborate because they create shared definitions and shared expectations. They also make risk assessments auditable and repeatable because a future assessor can see why certain risks were prioritized and why certain decisions were made. Without context, assessments become personality-driven, where outcomes depend on who is in the room and what they personally worry about. With context, assessments become process-driven, where outcomes follow a transparent logic. This matters for security engineering because systems outlive individuals, and organizations must be able to defend decisions years later, especially after incidents or audits. Beginners should see context building as a way to reduce confusion and conflict, not as an extra burden. To make context actionable, you should think of it as a living set of statements that must be reviewed when the system changes. If scope changes because a new integration is added, context must be updated because new attack paths exist. If assumptions change because the system moves to a new hosting model, the risk picture changes. If decision criteria change because leadership adjusts risk appetite after a major incident, the way you classify and respond to risk will change. Context is therefore not a one-time introduction. It is a control mechanism that keeps risk management aligned with reality. This is particularly important for beginners because it highlights that risk management is connected to system lifecycle and governance. By revisiting context, you prevent the dangerous situation where a system evolves, but risk practices stay frozen in an old picture. The takeaway is that risk context is the foundation that makes risk analysis meaningful and decision-making consistent. Scope defines what you are assessing and what responsibilities lie outside the boundary. Assumptions make explicit the conditions that shape risk and highlight uncertainty, and decision criteria define how findings will be judged and what actions are expected. When you establish these clearly, you reduce translation loss between technical and business perspectives, and you create a shared language for stakeholders to evaluate trade-offs. This does not eliminate risk, but it makes risk visible, manageable, and defendable, which is the real purpose of risk management. If you practice building context before jumping into threats and controls, you will produce better assessments, make better recommendations, and help organizations avoid the painful pattern of discovering too late that everyone was operating under different unspoken rules. That disciplined start is what allows the rest of the risk management process to work as intended.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.